Good morning. One of our many blessings at Zumbro Lutheran Church is a large number of retired pastors who are willing to share their gifts and talents with us. This morning, Pastor Duane Hoven is going to help us with a presentation. Next week, Pastor Paul Baker will help us celebrate Veterans Day. Pastor Hoven has become somewhat of a historian. I don't know if you always were a historian or not, but in his retirement, he has interviewed a number of Zumbro congregation members over the years and tells me he's anticipating interviewing a number more for our 150th celebration next year. So I don't think Pastor Duane Hoven needs a lot of introduction to this group, so let me just thank him for being with us, and we're excited to hear what he has to say.
Thank you, Tom. Well, the 150th begins officially in January. I think maybe in March is when they're going to kick off the festive events, but there are about 6 committees that are already at work getting organized and preparing for that time. As you can see up here, Zumbro's history goes back to right after the Civil War, 1865. So next year makes 150 years that we've put in. Curious, out of our group here this morning, anybody been around Zumbro at least 60 years? Let's see hands. There's a couple. I thought of Gene Alexander. Gene always claims to Gene back to, how many years have you been at Zumbro, Gene? Yes. 79. Anybody need that? Well, anyway, we have a long history here, and we want to celebrate a bit of that today. Zumbro's history prior to World War II is a very modest history. So this morning I'd like to introduce you to 4 very early pastors that served this area. They were very young pastors, I think all of them in their 20s or maybe barely 30. And it will be clear from the beginning that we have Norwegian roots in this congregation. A few of our members of the congregation that I did interview are going to be involved in helping. They'll help tell the story today. And a few of our members were involved at kind of a crossroads event in American history, and I'd like to highlight just a bit of that. As Harlan mentioned, I did about 35 interviews with members of our congregation some 10, 12 years ago. I think at least half of those are now gone and resting from their labors, and so we want to sort of celebrate a lot of that also on this All Saints Sunday. I've written a lot of Zumbro stories, and Ann always has the comment that I tend to embellish my stories a bit. So this morning it'll be gospel truth. Our first snapshot is John Linneville. As I mentioned, Zumbro had a very humble beginning. It was right after the Civil War. Norwegian pioneers were moving into southeast Minnesota. In 1865, a group of about 35 of these Norwegian pioneers formed the Rochester Evangelical Lutheran Congregation. For the next 55 years, Zumbro was part of a large rural parish that consisted of Casson, Hayfield, the Rockdale Parish, and Zumbro. Records indicate that the membership of the Zumbro congregation dwindled in 1893 to 7 voting members. And one pastor served that entire rural parish. And one of the most colorful of these pastors was John Linneville. John was born in 1868, so just 3 years after we organized as a congregation. John grew up in Decorah, Iowa, where he was a protege of Ulrich Wilhelm Koren. Anybody from Luther College? If you are, you recognize the name of Koren. Very instrumental. He is called the patriarch of Norwegian Lutheranism work here in the United States. Well, John was ordained into the Lutheran ministry in 1893, and so as a very young pastor, just months out of his ordination, began serving this little parish that involved Casson, Hayfield, Rockdale, and Rochester. To get from parish to parish, John rode his bicycle. I found on the internet Something I never knew before, but on the internet it says from September 1, 1893 until September 1, 1894, he put on his bicycle, how he measured it, I don't know, 3,985 miles. That's farther than from Seattle to Washington, D.C. on a bicycle. Yeah, the roads were not too good. Insights into Pastor Lindevold I gained from his grandchildren, John and Solveig Monkestead. Their mother, Agnes, was a daughter of Pastor Lindevold. And to further complicate our history, Agnes was married to Norvald Monkestead, who was our pastor from 1930 to 1950. But more about the Monkestead family later. Back to that last decade of the 19th century and young Pastor John Lindevold, serving this parish by riding his bicycle between congregations. Now his grandchildren describe him as a poet, a musician, who played the cello, the flute, and the ocarina. He liked archery and was fond of literature. While preaching, he would often step out of the pulpit and stroll down among the congregation. He was a noted preacher. And later, I think there was a parish in between, he moved from here to Glenwood, Minnesota. And he served that Glenwood parish, which became a large parish, from 1917 to 1944. And it said it was common for people in Starbuck and the area around Lake Minnewaska to drive on Sunday morning to Glenwood to hear Pastor Lindevold preach. 58 years ago, I was a young intern in the Glenwood parish, just 12 years after Lindevold had finished his ministry. I never knew about him. That's something I have learned much later. But John Monkestead, grandson John, tells this story. Pastor Lindevold was married to Anna. At the time of his marriage, he promised to Anna that he would quit smoking, and he did. In 1946, after the funeral of his wife Anna, Pastor Lindevold invited his grandson down to the local drugstore for a milkshake. While at the store, Pastor Lindevold purchased a box of cigars and then said to his young grandson, "I have waited 40 years for this." So in 2015, we want to celebrate Zumbro's 150 years and give thanks to God for Pastor John Lindevold, who rode his bicycle and served all of these parishes so very faithfully. A second story. A few years after Pastor Lindevold had served this parish, the congregations were served by another pastor from Decorah, Iowa, William K. Naiseth. And you might believe the K stands for Corin, another protege of Pastor Corin from Decorah. He served our parish from 1915 to 1922. So he was Zumbro's pastor during World War I. Pastor Naiseth in 1922 made the transition, however, from serving this rural parish to becoming a hospital chaplain, called by the Board of Charities of our national church. Now, I think that was a groundbreaking decision for the national church to call a pastor to be a full-time hospital chaplain. He continued for decades as a member of that National Protestant Chaplains Association. I suspect the current pastors at Zumbro have the same experience that Les and I did through the years. We get a phone call from a pastor in California or Texas or Florida that said, "I have a parishioner that's coming to St. Mary's Hospital, and would you make a personal pastoral call and bring them our best in a prayer?" And we would do that. But we always thank God that there were hospital chaplains who took care of that ongoing ministry that was needed. Well, one of the first Lutheran in the country to do that was this man, William Naiseth. Now, he did not have a car, so he routinely walked from his home on 6th Avenue Southeast to St. Mary's Hospital. As a widower, he made his home with his daughter Mary, and she was described as quiet, shy, and somewhat crippled. A former member recalled that her father, Herbert Hansen, and Pastor Naiseth both loved baseball, and she thought she remembered that they took the train one day to Chicago to watch the Cubs play baseball. Howard Steinlich, some of you might remember Howard, as a young single man, used to sit beside Pastor Naiseth in the Zumbro choir. And Pastor Naiseth had a long history in our congregation after he retired. In fact, Duane Piper talked about how he would lead the opening devotional for Sunday school children. She described him as humble, devout, highly respected, soft-spoken, but very strong in his beliefs. And Joanne recalled him walking between the hospitals, always with his head bowed, kind of in prayer, remembering the people that he had called upon. In his obituary, Chaplain Nassif visited as many as, get this, 725 patients a month. That's a lot of people. It was this transition when he moved from being pastor of this parish to the hospital chaplaincy that prompted Zumbro getting its first full-time pastor. Back to Howard Steinle. As a young man singing in the choir, Pastor Nassif beside him, one day a new young organist came to Zumbro. In 1947, Howard said that he felt an elbow in the ribs, and Pastor Nassif leaned over and whispered in his ear, "You better take a look at that one." Howard did take a look, and Greta Sorensen became his wife for love of his life. And in case you've missed it, as you enter our chapel up at Zumbro, there's a plaque on the wall. And it's a plaque that is dedicated in memory of this man, Pastor William K. Nassif. So we give thanks today for his faithful service to Zumbro, his ministry to patients in our hospitals. That's also, I think, a time for us to return thanks for all of the hospital chaplains that have had a connection to Zumbro and who still serve there. Bob, you're one of them that have served. Thanks to all of you who faithfully carried on that ministry. We move on. 90 years ago, Zumbro was worshiping in what was called the Little White Church on the corner. This white frame church on the corner of 2nd Avenue and 2nd Street was dedicated in 1909, and it served Zumbro for almost 20 years. Beginning in 1922, our small parish, this rural parish, was served by the Reverend Clarence Lee. Clarence was a graduate of Luther College and Luther Seminary, married and had served 2 years in South Dakota. When he received the call to serve now just Zumbro, just here in Rochester, 4 sons were born during their Rochester years. In 2004, I drove to Northfield and interviewed Walter Lee, a son. Walter's wife had died, and he had married Thelma Hansen, who had also grown up in Zumbro. Here's Walter's insight into his father, Clarence Lee. Quote, "My dad came out of the old Norwegian tradition. He spoke Norwegian, more Norwegian than he did English, but he was very good with both languages. He said the reason for that was because Luther was a classical college at that time, and you had to study Latin and Greek. Dad was really well grounded in those languages. He was a liturgist. And of course, Dad was very conservative. Records indicate that in 1929 at Zumbro, there were 49 services in the Norwegian language. In 1927, the congregation built this new brick church on 4th Street Southwest. Walter explains, and I quote, "The parsonage was connected to the church, and we lived there. I don't remember much about the parsonage, except that we played up and down the street on the sidewalk. The undertaker, Earl Vine, lived next door, and then another house with many foster children." Prior to World War II, the clear strength of the Norwegian American Lutheran Church was in the rural areas. That observation may explain why in 1930 Pastor Lee accepted a call to another parish, likely a bit larger and probably paying a larger salary. It was a call to Caledonia. And there he remained 20 years. For a long time, likely into World War II years, the rural parish of East and West St. Olaf, right out in Knockdale, was a good deal larger than this congregation in Rochester. Walter again remembers, in Caledonia, Dad became the contact person for local patients needing an appointment in the Rochester at the Mayo Clinic. Dad could get appointments very promptly. Often Dad would drive the patient to Mayo and then would go and play a round of golf while waiting. Sometimes Dad would take us along and drop us off at the Soldiers Field pool where we would go swimming. So this morning we return thanks to God who brought to Zumbro and to Zumbro this first resident pastor, Clarence Lee. And that brings us to Norvald and Agnes Mockestead. 10 years ago, I drove to rural Nearstrand and spent several hours visiting with John and Solveig, children of Pastor Norval Mockestead and his wife Agnes. That was an extremely emotional afternoon that I spent with them, hitting both the high and the low points in their memories of Zumbro years. John became a very valued member of the St. Olaf College art faculty, and John's bold and colorful painting hangs in the lounge. I think it was bought by the senior members of this congregation back in about the late 1970s. It's still there. And Solveig married Dick Beckman, pastor of the church, and Solveig and Dick reside today in retirement in Northfield. When the Mockestead family came to Zumbro in 1930, Norval was just the second pastor to serve just this congregation. Son John was 2 years old, and daughter Solveig was born a few years later. The Mockestead children grew up in the relatively new parsonage which was attached to the 4th Street Church. John and Solveig recalled that choir practices were often held in their living room, and there would be a Bible study in the kitchen. The adult children described their father as always meticulously dressed. He wore starched white shirts, pressed his own trousers, and twice a year he would faithfully clean his office by taking the books off the shelves. Then he would dust the shelves, wash the windows, and clean the curtains. He loved to garden and tend flowers. Norval also had a fine baritone voice, and throughout his life took voice lessons. He was well respected in the Rochester music community. He even wrote the Luther College fight song that is still sung at athletic events. John said of his dad, his world was in the 1920s and 1930s. He had a difficult time moving into the modern world. He was very conservative in his practice of day-to-day ministry. Money was always in short supply during Depression years. When Dad died, he had $1,200 to his name. In contrast, Solveig and John described Agnes, their mother. Remember, she's the daughter of the bicycle rider, Pastor Lindevold. Described their mother as chaotic, creative, spontaneous, loved the out of doors, and was quite helpless in the kitchen. She entertained many in the parsonage and was always making calls on parishioners who were hospitalized or folks new to the community. She too was gifted in music. The strong music tradition that is part of Zumbro's heritage, I think, owes a great deal to Norval and Agnes Mockestead. Agnes was key in securing the organ that was originally in the 4th Street Church. On one occasion, Agnes was asked to be the organist for a large convention at the Minneapolis auditorium, likely for the women of the church. And in that large auditorium, there's a colossal organ, one that is on a hydraulic lift. And they described this moment as saying, quote, "Mother had the organ on floor level with all the organ buttons in front of her like the cockpit of an airplane. She was just about to play when she pushed the wrong button, and slowly Mother and organ descended into a pit." Another Mother Agnes story. In our neighborhood, the kids built a high jump with a bar. We pretended we were Olympic jumpers, and we tried to jump over the rolling bar. One day, Mother came charging out of the parsonage door, ran across 3rd Avenue, and yelled, "Watch out!" and went sailing over the bar with her skirts flying. Solveig related a couple of delightful stories about her mother. One day, a person came to the parsonage demanding to talk to my dad about his sermon, claiming that Dad had preached evil. Dad took the person into his study and closed the door. In the living room, remember, which was a part of the house, in the living room we could hear the loud conversations from the study. John and I were lying on the floor reading the Sunday comics. Mother was on the couch. Mother sighed quietly. Such is life in the parsonage. One day in 1947, Mother received a phone call from a friend who was doing private nursing at the hospital. The friend asked if we had a porcelain pot. Mother immediately thought of vases and said yes. And she said, "No, I mean a chamber pot." Well, there was such a pot in our basement, so Mother said yes, we had a pot with a cover. The friend then explained that such a pot was needed for the Queen. Mother thought perhaps she was sarcastically referring to her roommate. But then came the full explanation. Queen Mother Nasli of Egypt was receiving medical care in Rochester and was not accustomed to modern flush toilets and preferred to use a chamber pot. So that day our pot was passed along for royal use. And there is a PS to the story. A few weeks after the Queen Mother had been returned to Egypt, a limousine pulled up to the parsonage and a dark-skinned man stepped out, came to the door, and handed Mother an envelope. And inside the envelope was a check for $300 made out to Zumbro for kindnesses extended. We did not get our pot back. The Makasted years at Zumbro closed with a very dark chapter. In 1944, an incident at Zumbro upset a number of parishioners. Pastor Makasted felt that it compromised the Lordship of Jesus Christ and said so publicly. Within a short time, there was pressure on Pastor Makasted to resign. John said that the district president, perhaps it would be called the bishop now, the district president said, Pastor Norvald, you will have to leave the parish. These struggles took a heavy toll on the family. John Makasted's son said, I think that I might have gone to the seminary, but for that painful experience of growing up in the parsonage. Maybe every parsonage is the same, a struggle between the ideal and the real. My dad always had to put on a good face, and we always were supposed to be perfect. Well, right after Christmas, 1949, the Makasted family moved to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where Pastor Makasted was to begin a new role as a hospital chaplain. It was not to be. Solveig explains, Dad died within a few weeks. The disease caused cirrhosis of the liver and affected many of his vital organs. I really think that their whole Zumbro experience was so crushing for Dad that it affected his health. The family returned to Rochester and Zumbro Lutheran for the funeral on February 23rd. Remember, he left January 1. Marvin Whitty, who died just weeks ago, told me that he had been in attendance here in Zumbro at that funeral. Marvin then was serving a parish in Chatfield at the time, and Marvin shared this experience. He said, and I quote Marvin, I felt the remorse of Zumbro congregation at his funeral. We sang hymn 239 from the Lutheran hymnary. I noted in my own hymnal that we had sung this at Norvald's funeral. The sixth stanza has these words. All trials are then like a dream that is past, forgotten all trouble and sorrow. All questions and doubts have been answered at last. Then dawneth eternity's morrow. Have mercy upon us, O Jesus. The final postscript to the Makasted story. A few years ago, with the help of Ava Sperling, we planned a reception in the Zumbro Lounge for John and Solveig. This was sometime after that 2004 interview that I'd had with them. In the course of the research, I had discovered that Pastor Makasted had written a musical selection for the Mayo Clinic Carillon. Jeff Dane, our former minister of music here, and now the Carillioner at Mayo, agreed to play the piece at an agreed-upon hour after that reception. And so following that reception, John and Solveig and a few others drove a few blocks to downtown Rochester. And there in an empty parking lot on a very cold, blustery afternoon with the sun setting, and in tears we listened to that beautiful carillon music that had been composed by Pastor Makasted. Agnes had written the words that said, we praise and thank thee, Lord, for goodness through these years, for tasks of love, for you and tears that lift our hearts to thee. O may we love thee more with strength and of mind and heart. Thy benediction will impart eternal victory, eternal victory. So today on All Saints' Day, let us return thanks to God for Pastor Norvald and Agnes Makasted. Monica Gudrias was born in Latvia in 1911. Her hometown was 45 miles from the Russian border. Over 10 years ago, I interviewed Monica in her apartment at Fontaine Towers. At that time, she was 93 years old. I recall pulling up my chair to the table and just tossed out a question. I said, well, Monica, tell me about your growing up here. And she started out, and for 45 minutes, she never sat down. She told me the story of her life, and it was a powerful, powerful story. Thank you so much. Monica recalled the early days in Latvia, the confinement in camps in Germany and Czechoslovakia, her later years in Rochester. It was a moving time listening to this woman who chose to survive and then make the rest of her life a real witness to her faith. She had not had an easy life as a child. She told me, and I quote, "When my father died, there were 7 in our family. My mother washed sheets and pillowcases 10 hours a day. In 1937, Monica was united in marriage to Siegfried Gudrias, and they were blessed with a daughter and 2 sons. Their relatively secure life changed abruptly in 1940 when the Russians came and took everything from us. Most of our town was burned. They endured difficult years. Then the German armies entered Latvia and for a time drove the Russians back east. In 1944, Monica reported, "One day my husband came home and said that we must leave. He had seen his name on the list. Siegfried had been identified as a dissident and felt that it would be only a short time before he would be deported to Siberia. Monica and her husband and family fled Latvia and spent harrowing months in camps in Germany and Czechoslovakia. Eventually they were given asylum in the Russian zone, and she recalled people kneeling down on the ground and kissing the ground, feeling that they were once again safe. After World War II, Monica and Gudrias moved to Hutchinson, Minnesota. There Monica did cleaning for people, making 75 cents an hour. When the company that Siegfried was working for was sold, they began seeking other work options, and that led them here to Rochester. Siegfried died in 1963, and by that time the children had been scattered. Monica became part of Zumbro congregation and spoke glowingly of the welcome she had received from Pastor Abner Haugen. A friend here at church, Greta Steinlich, you've heard of Greta before, the young organist? Greta Steinlich offered Monica a job, assisting Greta's parents, Martin and Martha Sorensen, with their daily routines. It was a godsend for Monica. She spent 28 years assisting this family and managing a guest house. On Sunday mornings, Monica would always invite the guests to join her in worship at Zumbro. During these years, she became a gift of God to patients at the Mayo Clinic and at the hospitals. Monica spoke 5 languages fluently and became a valued translator, helping doctors and nurses explain to patients procedures that were needed and medications that had to be taken properly. At Zumbro, persons attending I'm not sure what we call it, the senior fellowship luncheons, always looked forward to Monica's Latvian rolls. Her tray of delicacies went quickly. And so Monica, born in Latvia, richly blessed by God, watched over by His Holy Spirit during turbulent years in order that she might be a blessing to folks in Rochester and at Zumbro. Monica died at the age of 96. Today we give thanks for her life. The decade of the 1960s witnessed racial national strife in both South and North. There is a fascinating connection that Zumbro Lutheran has to that stressful time in our history. It centers on a man born south of Rochester in Houston County, Minnesota, Verdeen Erickson. He came from hearty Norwegian stock. Verdeen lived well into his 80s. Brothers Elvin and Clarence, who were members here, lived into their 90s, and Sister Edna Westby, also a Zumbro member, died at the age of 102. Verdeen started as a car salesman in the middle of the Depression, and it proved to be difficult. One day, Verdeen said he sold a car to Superintendent Smith of the Rochester State Hospital, and that opened the door for some possibilities. For those of you that are rather new to Rochester, let me tell you a bit about the history of that institution. Formerly called the Asylum for the Inebriates, the State Hospital for the Insane was opened in 1879, and in that same year, 68 mentally ill patients were transferred from the St. Peter, Minnesota Hospital. The only portion of the state hospital left when this was written was the cemetery where 2,019 patients had been buried in unmarked graves. The hospital was officially closed in 1982, to make room for the federal prison, and in 2007 the project was started to research the old records and to identify the remains in the cemetery. At this date, only 530 graves have been marked. Well, Burdine became part of the staff at the Rochester State Hospital and worked there for 40 years. And most of those years became a strong and steady advocate for patients. This experience, in addition to his family roots, made Burdine a real crusader for people seeking justice. Thus, it wasn't perhaps so strange that in the spring of 1968, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, that Burdine took off for Memphis and that historic march. Journalists decried that few whites were in that march, but among them was Burdine of Zumbro Lutheran. In an interview, Burdine commented, "I marched among 30,000 people with National Guard on the watch. I marched next to a black school teacher, and we hooked arms and started talking. In Rochester, I received a great deal of publicity. Dorothy and I went to church soon after, the church on 4th Street. We both noticed that people were not sitting next to us. Some parishioners looked at me so bewildered, and a few hardly wanted to say hello. It took time for that to work its way through." Such a patient man, not accepting that everybody had to be exactly where he was in his understanding of justice and fairness. So we give thanks for Burdine Erickson, an early bridge builder. An unusually gifted theologian and scholar appeared on the scene in our national American Lutheran Church in the 1960s. Born in 1924 on a farm in Iowa, Kent Knutson graduated from high school at the age of 16, enrolled at Iowa State University. He served briefly in the United States Navy during World War II. In 1968, he was elected president of our seminary in Dubuque, Iowa, a position he held for only 2 years. At the National Convention of the American Lutheran Church in 1970 in San Antonio, Kent was nominated for the presidency of the church. In a close vote, Kent Knutson was declared the new leader of our national ALC. 2 years after his election, Kent and his wife Norma started a world trip to visit all the mission fields sponsored by the church. It was rigorous and demanding. Visits to Papua New Guinea, Hong Kong, Japan, India, Africa. On this fateful trip, Kent began to experience a high fever. An appointment was made with neurology here at Mayo Clinic. On October 18, 1972, Kent was admitted to St. Mary's Hospital. After 2 months of examination, Kent was diagnosed as having Jacob Creutzfeldt syndrome, an incurable brain-wasting disease. There was the suspicion that the invasion into Kent's body may have occurred during his visit to the tropics of Papua New Guinea. The entire church was stunned by this medical turn of events. Kent was 48 years old and seemed to have decades of service to the church still ahead of him. Early in his stay, there were many visitors. I too went to St. Mary's many times until his condition deteriorated and visiting was not appropriate. During these troubling weeks, there were so many coming here to Rochester and wanting to pray for and with the bishop. It was felt by some that they were beginning to transgress the wishes of the family as well as the hospital staff. And I recall a letter that was sent to the entire church, I think by Dr. Wheatsky. Undoubtedly, during these agonizing weeks here at Zumbro, the congregation remembered our bishop in prayers. But shortly after Christmas, Kent was transported by ambulance to a hospital in Robbinsdale to be simply closer to the family home. And there he died March 12, 1973, and is buried in the rural church cemetery of his childhood home in Iowa. There's one final connection to Zumbro. Upon the death of Kent, the American Lutheran Church had to schedule an installation for a new president or a new presiding bishop of the national church. It would be David Price, and the service of installation was held here at Zumbro. I recall coming from the congregation I was serving at the time in Faribault and sitting on a step to the balcony simply because our church was so crowded. I believe the reason for this national installation held here had to do with the district convention of the church that was just opening, and Minneapolis St. Paul were part of our district at that time. So we were part of a very, very significant moment in church history. And today, On All Saints Sunday, we give thanks for the leadership that Dr. Kent Knudsen gave to this church. Years ago, I went to the 20th floor of Charter House to do an interview with a 98-year-old member of Zumbro, Lucia Stowe Carr. Lucia was born in rural Orinoco, attended school in Rochester, and graduated in the first medical secretarial class in the nation from our local junior college. Lucia married, had a successful medical secretarial career that took her to Wisconsin, to Boston, Chicago, New Jersey, and after the death of her husband, she moved back to Rochester and joined Zumbro in the early 1980s. The interview with Lucia was prompted by her leadership with Zumbro's sponsorship of refugees from Southeast Asia. That started in 1979 with the Vincent Ton family, followed in 1980 by Hato Chow, in 1983 by Hing Chung and her family, and in 1985 by the Song Muth family of 11 refugees. It was a busy time from 1980 to 1985 in our congregation as we were sponsoring these families. Lucia was especially helpful with Hing Chung in the red jacket in front and her two children, Ref, a young boy, and Sarini, a younger girl. Hing Chung had survived tragedy in Cambodia, having to watch the execution of her husband and her sons and other members of her family. Sarini was her daughter, but Ref had been adopted under her care during a camp for refugees. Lucia, she's up on the upper right next to Dave. Luther was faithful in keeping regular contact with this small family. She guided them in shopping for groceries, dealing with differences in their neighborhood, issues at school for the children, banking, and other day-to-day matters. And Zumbro embraced these folks from Vietnam and Cambodia. Cyrene was confirmed and the family baptized. Zumbro folks gave generously of their time and counsel to these new friends. Hing Chung still lives in Rochester and has visited Cambodia on more than one occasion. Cyrene is married and she too still lives in Rochester. This final remembrance today is for a good friend, a colleague who was a faithful member of Zumbro and a strong contributor to our Rochester community. He was a competitor that I met often on the tennis court and on the golf links. In October 2004, exactly 10 years ago, I spent an hour with David, visiting with him about his life and the fact that his life journey was quickly coming to an end. David and Avis raised their 6 children and took an active role in the life of our congregation. David was chair of the stewardship committee. He served as president of Zumbro. He later served 5 years as treasurer of the Southeastern Minnesota Synod of our ELCA. At the interview, I asked David to recall when the gospel and the ministry of Zumbro had made a significant impact on him and his family. Here was David's response. Well, that is a complex question. I want to open up on a very personal level. You are talking to me near the conclusion of my life. You will have to forgive me if I get emotional. The experience I have had from Zumbro over the past 2 or 3 months has been remarkable. How many of our dear friends who also happen to be members of Zumbro have come forward with prayer. Prayer has been so critically important. As family and friends, we have been allowed to come together in a way which I would never have dreamed possible. There are so many words of praise and positive feelings that I would like to express. I truly sense the power of prayer. I cannot explain it, but the power is there. I gladly receive the support even from people I do not know. I feel so blessed to be a member of Zumbro at this point in my life. And I also asked David how he handled that difficult diagnosis that he had so recently received from the Mayo Clinic, and David responded. Writers who have experienced what I am going through and who are very articulate and gifted are blessed. They have obviously lived long enough to write down their feelings and the final journey they are taking. I am reasonably certain that not all experience the same emotions or cope with them in the same manner. I believe the grieving process and accepting such finality is different for everyone. As I continue my journey to the end of life, it seems that I am touching upon these stages that some writers have described. Some would blame God for their difficulties, but I do not believe that they are attributable to God. The model we have at Zumbro for carrying out the responsibility of church living is a real blessing. We need to share our model because the team effort at Zumbro staff along with the lay leadership is absolutely marvelous. I want that to come through loud and clear. As a synod of congregations, we need to equip pastors and lay staff with the resources necessary to minister to persons going through end-of-life times. The Zumbro model can be of help to many. And I concluded that brief visit to Dave with these words. David, your observations and wisdom coming out of your present experience is a valuable contribution to the archives at Zumbro. Your words, embedded in deep emotion, may well give insight and a measure of comfort to someone in decades to come. Surely your message will be a reminder to the church that care and support to those walking in the darkest of valleys is a priority for every generation. So today, on this All Saints Sunday, we give thanks to all those who are resting from their labors, including my friend David. Maybe we can close by reading this together. When we on that final journey know that Christ is for us preparing, we'll gather in song our hearts aglow, all joy of the heavens sharing, and there we will join God's endless praise with angels and saints